What happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II? When American and Soviet troops began tracking down Nazi leaders to bring them to trial in Nuremberg, they often found only their wives. The husbands were either dead or had fled the country. A fierce debate followed about what should be done with these frightened women. Were they witnesses, innocent spectators, accomplices, or perpetrators? They all claimed, in a sense, playing the role of devoted housewives, taking care of their children and husbands. In some cases, this was true, but for most, the reality was far more sinister. These women became some of the most infamous and unrepentant figures in history. Nazi princesses who loved German war criminals. All were affiliated with the Nazi Party, sometimes well before meeting their husbands, and in most cases they outlived them, keeping the flame of anti-Semitism and racism alive. Learn what tragic fates awaited these wives, mothers, and lovers. After their beloved Third Reich lost World War II, Gerda Bormann, the devoted wife of the devil. Not all wives of Nazi leaders were Nazis. Gerda Bormann, however, was absolutely devoted to the ideology and party of Adolf Hitler, and was undoubtedly the first Nazi princess in history. Born in 1909 in Constance into a family of Nazi enthusiasts, it was her father, Walter Bull, who introduced young Gerda to Uncle Adolf. If there was a difference, Gerda was even more fanatical than her father, something that became clear when she became involved with a stocky, thick-necked man named Martin Bormann, a newcomer to the movement who joined the party in February 1927. He briefly worked as a press officer in his local area before moving to the SA, the Nazi Party's paramilitary wing. It was there that he first made contact with Gerda's father. Gerda fell madly in love with him, and they married in 1929. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Bormann became Rudolf Hess's chief of staff and later Hitler's personal secretary, reaching the height of his career. Gerda couldn't have been prouder of her husband and enjoyed the perks of his elevated position while caring for their 9 children. However, as the Soviet army approached Berlin in 1945, Gerda fled with her 9 children. She took advantage of the chaos, posing as the director of an orphanage with 4 of her children disguised as orphans. The other 5 were taken by Martin Bormann to facilitate the escape. But seeing there was no way out, he took his own life by biting down on a cyanide pill. His body, however, wouldn't be found until much later. Soachi, the Chimi-Allied investigators, had no idea of his death. Meanwhile, Gerda boarded a school bus with the children and managed to cross the border into Italy, stopping in South Tyrol, where they were received by the regional Nazi leader. He had arranged a place to hide all Gerda's sensitive materia and found them a home in a small village in a valley 48 kilometers from Bolzano. Although safe for the time being, Gerda was in terrible agony. Her sister-in-law, who had traveled with her, noted that Gerda, usually a quiet person, couldn't stop complaining about a pain in her lower body. Once settled in Bolzano, they found a local Italian doctor who immediately recognized the seriousness of her condition. Gerda was suffering from advanced ovarian cancer and needed surgery as soon as possible. By this time, the Allies were hot on her trail. 2 intelligence agents tracked her down and informed the British unit stationed in the area. After consulting the doctor who had diagnosed Gerda, a British Army major appeared at her door. Gerda panicked, thinking he would take her to a concentration camp, but the major reassured her that she was not in danger. Instead, she was taken directly to a prisoner of war hospital in Marano. The surgery took place, but to no effect. Facing her impending death, Gerda sought comfort in religion and converted to Catholicism. She died on March 23, 1946, a few months before her 37th birthday. Magda Goebbels, the avid reader of Mein Kampf, On May 1, 1945, Magda Goebbels might have envied Gerda Bormann, who had been lucky enough to escape the country. As it turned out, she would never know what happened to Gerda. Johanna Maria Magdalena Richter was born in 1901 and spent most of her childhood in Brussels, but was repatriated to Germany when World War I broke out. In 1921, she married a wealthy German industrialist named Gunther Quandt, who was twice her age. In 1929, when Quandt discovered she had been unfaithful, he decided to end the marriage, leaving her with a small fortune and a luxurious apartment in Berlin. While in Berlin, during this time, it was impossible to ignore the daily confrontations between Nazis and their opponents. Encouraged by several friends, Magda attended a large Nazi rally where the main speaker was Joseph Goebbels. Besides Hitler, Goebbels was the Nazis' most effective public speaker, stirring the audience as he spoke, bristling with aggression. He was highly intelligent, highly educated, and had a PhD in literature from Heidelberg University. But he was also a small man with a twisted foot and a pronounced limp. Magda didn't pay attention to this, but was captivated by his voice and ideas. She immediately joined the party and bought a copy of Mein Kampf and the Myth of the 20th Century, a disjointed work written by Nazi philosopher Alfred Rosenberg. Magda quickly became the leader of the local Nazi women's group, but her presence caused friction with other members who objected to taking orders from a woman of such high privilege. Frustrated, Magda aimed higher and applied for a job in Goebbels' propaganda department, where he could not help but notice her. Impressed by Magda's obvious class and beauty, Goebbels asked her to take responsibility for his private files, hoping that working so close to him would make it easier for him to seduce her. By February 1931, Magda and Goebbels were having an affair. Their relationship developed, and by April, they were planning their future together. Magda's apartment in Theodor-Heusius-Platz soon became one of the main meeting places for Adolf Hitler and other Nazi officials. This caused some problems for the Goebbels family, as Joseph became jealous of the attention Hitler paid to Magda. The fact that Magda was also in love with Hitler didn't help the couple, however. This was also the main reason she married Goebbels, to be closer to them. On December 19, 1931, Goebbels and Magda, who was already pregnant, married in a civil ceremony, followed by a religious service. Hitler was their godfather. When Magda kissed him to thank him, his eyes were filled with tears. On September 1, 1932, their first daughter, Helga, was born. Magda's experience was traumatic, leaving her exhausted and very weak. Her doctor explained that the birth had aggravated a pre-existing heart condition, so she needed to take care in the future. Despite this, and before she had fully recovered, she became pregnant again but suffered a miscarriage in December. The couple spent that New Year's Eve at Hitler's country house in Obet Ilyes Agael, philosophy, literature, and his murder. One night, young and wealthy Ilse Prohau met one of her neighbors in Munich, a tall young man wearing a tattered uniform, who introduced himself as Rudolf Hess. She was immediately impressed by his appearance, his thick eyebrows, deep-set eyes, and haunted expression. She felt an instant attraction to him. Whether Hess, 26 years old, had a similar reaction is impossible to say. Of all the senior Nazis, Hess was the most enigmatic. Throughout his life, it would become clear that he had suffered from mental health issues from an early age. Hess was also a decorated war hero who had been wounded twice in battle. Ilse decided to pursue him, and they began spending time together. They became good friends, as their relationship was purely platonic. Still a virgin, Hess showed no interest in sex. In the years that followed, their relationship lacked a physical dimension, frustrating Ilse. Instead, they cultivated a spiritual connection based on their shared love for German culture, especially late 18th and early 19th century Romantic writers and composers. Ilse's favorite writer was Friedrich Schiller. By the fall of 1920, Ilse had completed her secondary education, started a part-time university course in German studies and library science, and began working at a rare bookshop. Besides occasional trips outside Munich to visit the countryside, she spent most of her free time working for the Nazi movement, delivering leaflets, posting posters, helping with the party newspaper, and acting as Hess' secretary while he connected with Hitler and put his body at risk during the frequent clashes between Nazi supporters and their leftist opponents. In recognition of their efforts, Ilse and Hess were given the privilege of being near Hitler during their free time. Eventually, Hess and Hitler became very good friends. In 1923, Hess was one of the loyal soldiers who fought alongside Hitler during the failed beer hall putsch in Munich. Fearing capture, Hess called Ilse to inform her that he would try to cross the border to Austria, which he did. He later returned to Germany to visit Ilse, but was captured and imprisoned along with Hitler and other instigators. Ilse never missed visiting him. Every Saturday, when Hess was allowed 6 hours of visitation. The aftermath and trials of Nuremberg. Hess was highly valued by Ilse for his loyalty, and after his imprisonment, they married in 1927. They had one son in 1937. By this time, Hess had been appointed Reich Minister and spent long hours working. When war broke out in 1939, he became increasingly paranoid and his mental health declined. In 1941, he decided to fly to Scotland alone in hopes of negotiating a peace treaty directly with the British government. The British authorities imprisoned him as a prisoner of war. After hearing the news, Ilse took their son and withdrew to a town called Hindelong to stay away from Munich and Hitler's fury against Rudolf, who was considered a deserter. Rudolf Hess was one of the first Nazis to be tried and convicted in the Nuremberg trials. On June 3, 1947, Ilse Hess was arrested in Munich. Like all wives of convicted or executed war criminals during the Nuremberg trials, she was transferred to an internment camp in G. On March 24, 1948, she was released and settled in the Bavarian Alps, where she opened a guest house in 1955. Rudolf was serving a life sentence in Spandau prison, which she visited on weekends. Ilse remained a devoted Nazi until her death at 95. She remained loyal to Hitler and his views, and after the war became a highly respected author. She published a popular book in 1952 and followed it up in 1954 with a book entitled Rudolf Hess, Prisoner of Peace, the first in a series of collections of her correspondence with her husband. After his death in 1995, she requested to be buried next to him in Wunsiedel, Bavaria. Margaret Himmler, the silent collaborator. Margrit Baudem met Heinrich Himmler during a 3-hour train ride from Munich to Berlin. They struck up a conversation, and by the end of the journey, a connection had been made. After following separate paths, they began exchanging letters, a nearly daily habit that continued throughout their relationship, largely because they were more often apart than together. Margrit was 8 years older than Himmler. From a comfortable landowning family, Margrit was old enough to join the German Red Cross in 1914 and become a nurse. After completing her training, she was sent to a field hospital. Shortly after the end of the war, she married him. Their marriage plans depended on Marguerite selling her portion of the property she had inherited and using the money to buy land. They were going to become farmers. This was a long-held ambition of Himmler. But Hitler had other plans for one of his most loyal associates. Himmler had a successful career in the Nazi Party, becoming the head of police, the leader of the Waffen-SS, and Minister of the Interior under Hitler's presidency. Himmler was also responsible for overseeing the extermination programs for Jews. In May 1945, Himmler and Marguerite separated, promising to meet again abroad. Himmler was captured and ingested a cyanide pill, dying almost instantly. Marguerite and their daughter Gudrun left the town of Gemont as Allied forces advanced in the area. After the U.S. Army invaded Bolzano, Italy, in May 1945, Marguerite and Gudrun were arrested. They were held in various internment camps in Italy, France, and Germany. During their internment, Marguerite was interrogated, but it became clear that she was not informed about her husband's official business. Later that year, she was called to testify at the Nuremberg trials, where she also claimed innocence. She and Gudrun were released in November 1946 from internment. They sought refuge for a while at the Bethel Institution in Belarus. Marguerite maintained that, although she had been Himmler's wife, she kept a low profile. However, the Allied Committee monitoring her actions was convinced that she likely supported the goals of the Nazi Party and endorsed her husband's actions. Her lawyer insisted during the subsequent appeal process that Marguerite could not be held responsible for her husband's actions. Between 1948 and 1953, Marguerite was involved in 3 different trials. The final result was that a judge decided she should not be held accountable for her husband's crimes, despite not being distant from them. On January 15, 1953, she was classified as a beneficiary of the Nazi regime and sentenced to 30 days of forced labor. She also lost her pension rights and her right to vote. Her daughter Gudrun left Bethel in 1952, and from the fall of 1955, Marguerite lived with her sister Lydia in Ypres. Marguerite told Lydia that all she hoped for was a peaceful life and was content to fade into obscurity. That's exactly what she did. When she died on August 25, 1967, at the age of 74, she took with her all the secrets of her husband, including all his affairs, sleeping with evil, Hedwig Pothast. In fact, as Marguerite Himmler once confessed to one of the American interrogators, her husband was never very faithful. His most famous affair was with his 26-year-old secretary,